Even today, when the snow falls deep across Finland's forests, some say you can still feel him there, not as a ghost, but as a guardian, a reminder that true strength doesn't come from anger or numbers or noise. It comes from stillness, from purpose, from the quiet heart that refuses to yield. Simo Haiha lived a long life after the war, surrounded by the same forests that once echoed with gunfire. He spent his final years in peace, tending his land, smiling softly when people called him a hero. To him, heroism was simple: do your duty, stay humble, and protect what you love. His story will always live on, not in textbooks, not just in military history, but in every heart that believes in courage without hatred, strength without cruelty, and pride without arrogance. And if this story moved you, if the legend of the White Death inspired you to find that quiet strength within yourself, then take a moment, breathe, reflect, and remember that history is kept alive by those who choose to remember it. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more true tales of courage, sacrifice, and the forgotten heroes of history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with others who love storytelling that brings the past to life. Because stories like this deserve to be remembered. This is your channel, where history breathes again. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and never stop listening to the whispers of the past. The Eastern Front, where mercy froze before the rivers did. It was a place where time stopped, and survival became the only measure of existence. For thousands of German soldiers, what began as a promise of swift victory in 1941 turned into a nightmare carved into the endless steps of the Soviet Union. These are their confessions, drawn from the diaries, letters, and whispered memories of men who lived and died far from home. One of them was Heinrich Müller, a 19-year-old conscript from Munich, who wrote his mother in the summer of 1941, "Don't worry, Mutti. They say we'll be in Moscow by Christmas." His handwriting was neat then, confident, still untouched by the frost and madness to come. Heinrich served with the Sixth Army under General Paulus, ordinary men caught in an extraordinary tide of history. When Operation Barbarossa began, they were greeted with wide fields, endless skies, and burning villages. They believed they were liberators. Soon they realized they were invaders, marching into a land that swallowed armies whole. The first confessions came not from guilt, but from disbelief.
Heinrich described villages where even the dogs had learned to hide, and where peasants stared at them with eyes that seemed older than time. "We found no resistance," he wrote, "only silence. But it was a silence that hated us." The Wehrmacht's march east was swift at first. Smolensk, Kiev, Kharkov, all names that sounded like stepping stones toward victory. Yet, for every mile gained, a piece of their humanity was lost. Men shot prisoners without orders, burned barns for warmth, and looted bread from the hands of children. Some obeyed because of fear, others because the cold made them forget what it meant to be human. In his later confession, written in captivity years after the war, Heinrich admitted, "We were not monsters when we came, but the snow, it changes you.
It buries your soul before your body." By the time the first winter came, the once proud German columns were reduced to crawling skeletons, trapped in white wastelands where rifles froze faster than tears. They burned books, icons, even furniture to survive. The Red Army, once broken and retreating, now turned the land itself into a weapon. Every village became a fortress, every river a trap. Heinrich's unit lost 200 men in a single week near the Volga. "We stopped counting," he confessed. "You can't count ghosts." Then came Stalingrad, the city whose name would haunt generations. Heinrich remembered the first bombardment, how the city lit up like a dying sun. "We thought we had destroyed it," he wrote, "but the Russians kept coming from the rubble, like the city itself refused to die." There were no front lines anymore, only rooms fought over, floors soaked in blood. Soldiers began to question not the war, but the world itself. "Why are we here?" Heinrich once asked his comrade Otto. Otto answered, "Because someone far away decided we should be." As the encirclement closed in and food vanished, the Sixth Army's letters turned into prayers. Bread became more valuable than bullets. Men ate horseflesh, glue, even leather. One soldier confessed to eating pages from a Bible because the paper was soft and it felt like hope. "I remember biting into a verse and praying it would feed me." When Paulus finally surrendered in February 1943, the survivors, what little remained of them, were marched into captivity through the ruins of the East. Heinrich was one of the few who made it out alive, but not whole. In his last recorded words before his death in 1972, he said, "The Eastern Front never ends. It stays inside you. I see it when it snows." When the guns finally fell silent over the ruins of Stalingrad, the world believed the battle was over. But for the men who survived, the true war had only begun. Across the endless whiteness of the Russian plains, columns of ragged prisoners shuffled eastward, leaving behind the ghosts of 200,000 comrades. Their boots were gone, their faces hollow, and their eyes, those eyes, looked as if they'd seen the end of the world. Among them was Otto Kruger, once a machine gunner in the 297th Infantry Division. In his confession, recorded by a Soviet interpreter in 1945, he said, "They called us prisoners, but we were already dead when they found us." The march to the camps was a slow annihilation. Men collapsed in the snow and were left where they fell, the frost covering them like a shroud. Those who reached the trains were herded into boxcars so tight that no one could sit, only lean on one another. The smell of death followed them everywhere. Otto wrote, "When the doors opened, sometimes half of us didn't move, the others didn't have the strength to care." The Soviet camps were not built for comfort, but for penance. In Beketovka, Tambov, and Sverdlovsk, German prisoners faced the cold justice of the East, disease, starvation, and an unending routine of labor that turned days into gray oblivion. Yet, in that darkness, the first flickers of confession appeared. A medic named Friedrich Lenz began writing what he called the Testament of the Fallen. He documented the cries of wounded Russians he could not save, the atrocities he witnessed committed by his own countrymen, and the growing realization that the cause he fought for was poisoned from the start. He wrote, "I thought we were the army of order, but in every burning village I saw the order of hell." Soviet officers encouraged these writings, not from compassion, but from curiosity. They wanted to understand what drove a nation of poets and engineers to become executioners in uniform. Many of the captured men spoke not of ideology, but of obedience, fear, and blindness. "We did not hate," Otto said in one interview. "We obeyed, and obedience can be more dangerous than hate." Years passed in the camps. Winters blended together. Some found strange companionship among their captors. Russian guards who shared cigarettes, bits of bread, or stories of their own dead. Others withdrew into silence, consumed by shame. In 1947, the Soviets began a series of recordings known as the Stalingrad Protocols, gathering testimonies from thousands of survivors. In one tape, a former SS lieutenant wept uncontrollably as he described watching a column of Soviet civilians being executed outside Kharkov. "I told myself it was war," he sobbed, "but war doesn't shoot children in the snow." The confessions became a strange form of redemption for some, a curse for others. Friedrich Lenz, before dying of typhus, wrote in the margins of his notebook, "To confess is not to be forgiven, it is to remember honestly."
By 1949, only a fraction of the German prisoners had returned home. They came back to a country divided, not just by borders, but by memory. Many never spoke again of what they saw, but their diaries remained, hidden in attics and archives, waiting to tell the truth history tried to forget. For those who lived through it, the Eastern Front was not a campaign, it was a crucifixion of the human spirit. We went to Russia as soldiers and came back as ghosts.
When the guns fell silent and the banners came down, the soldiers who returned from the Eastern Front found themselves in a country that no longer wanted to hear their stories. Germany was rebuilding, its cities rising from ashes, its people struggling to forget. But the men who came home from the East carried something that couldn't be buried under brick and mortar. They carried silence. For years, they sat in train stations, in dimly lit bars, and in small, crowded apartments, haunted by faces they could not name and screams they could not forget. One of them was Captain Hans Riedel, once a decorated officer of the 6th Infantry Division. When the war ended, he became a quiet school teacher in Hamburg. To his students, he was polite, gentle, unremarkable. But at night, his wife would wake to find him standing by the window, trembling, whispering in Russian words he did not understand. In 1952, during a reunion of old veterans, Hans broke his silence. "We thought we were the civilized ones," he confessed, "but out there on the steppe, I saw men become animals, and the worst of them wore the same uniform I did." A journalist present that night recorded his words, later publishing them anonymously in a small post-war paper titled Voices from the Steppe. It was one of the first glimpses into the unspoken guilt shared by thousands. The Nuremberg trials had shown the world the crimes of the regime, but not the quiet, ordinary atrocities of the battlefield. The farmers executed for hiding bread, the children shot for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the prisoners who froze because no one dared to share a blanket. These were not grand crimes of strategy. They were the small, everyday evils that corroded the soul. In Soviet archives, interrogators recorded the broken words of captured German soldiers. One colonel, trembling before his captors, whispered, "This is not war. This is what happens when men forget they are human." But even then, not all spoke the truth. Some denied everything, hiding behind the same phrase, "I was only following orders." That line echoed in courtrooms, letters, and confessions for decades, a shield for the guilty, a wound for the survivors. In Moscow, tapes of the NKVD interrogations revealed hours of fractured voices, Men weeping, shouting, or going completely silent as they confronted the ghosts of what they'd done. One SS officer admitted, "I killed my own comrade because he refused to shoot civilians. I told myself it was duty, but duty should never make you murder your own soul." Back in Germany, the post-war generation began asking questions their fathers couldn't answer. They found medals hidden behind bookshelves, blood-stained letters in attics, diaries sealed in boxes. Some confronted their fathers, demanding the truth. Others stayed silent, afraid of what they might hear. Hans Riedel's daughter would later say, "I never understood why my father froze whenever he heard a Russian song on the radio. Only when I read his diary did I understand. He never left the snow." By the 1960s, the silence began to crack. A German television documentary titled Der Weg nach Osten, The Road to the East, brought surviving soldiers before the camera for the first time. Gray-haired men, once feared warriors, sat trembling as they read their own letters from the front. Millions of viewers watched in silence as the past they'd tried to bury returned through their own voices. One veteran, his hands shaking, read, "We thought the Russians were beasts, but the beast was inside us all along." That night the nation wept. For the first time, the Eastern Front was no longer a distant battlefield. It was a wound that still bled inside every family, every silence, every snowstorm that fell over Germany. These confessions, fragile and incomplete, did not bring forgiveness, but they gave the truth a voice. And sometimes that is all a soul needs to begin healing. By the 1970s, the soldiers of the Eastern Front had grown old, but their memories had not aged. They had only deepened, like cracks in ice waiting to break. Germany was now divided between East and West. Two nations sharing the same guilt, but never the same truth. In the East, the Soviet-backed regime demanded public condemnation of fascism, but offered no room for personal confession. In the West, silence lingered in family dinners, in old photographs, and in the careful way fathers avoided certain questions from their sons. But truth, no matter how long it is buried, eventually finds air. In 1973, a cache of notebooks surfaced in a Moscow archive, personal diaries taken from German prisoners after Stalingrad, sealed away for 30 years. Among them were the writings of Friedrich Lenz, the medic who had recorded the suffering of soldiers and civilians alike before dying in captivity. His words, translated and published under the title "Through the Snow, Without Forgiveness," shocked both sides of the Iron Curtain. "We believed we were the sword of civilization," he wrote. "But every time we killed, something inside us turned to ash." The book was banned in East Germany, but circulated in secret, photocopied by students and passed hand to hand. In the West, it became a grim mirror for a generation that had grown up in the shadow of denial. Journalists began tracing families of the men mentioned in those diaries, finding widows who had never been told the truth, children who thought their fathers had been heroes, not participants in atrocities. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the confessions collected by the NKVD, thousands of hours of recordings, lay hidden in dusty basements, guarded by silence and fear. But in the 1980s, as glasnost swept across the crumbling USSR, fragments of these interrogations began to emerge. Soviet historians, once forbidden to question official narratives, now listened to the voices of their former enemies and found humanity where propaganda had painted only monsters. One Russian archivist, after hearing a tape of a captured German soldier weeping over a Russian child's death, wrote in her journal, "He was our enemy, but in that moment he was only human." The Cold War world was built on divisions, but these confessions blurred them. They revealed that pain had no nationality. By the 1990s, as the Berlin Wall fell and the archives opened, a flood of new documents, letters, and films poured into public view. Television channels aired interviews with the last living veterans of the Eastern Front. Old men with shaking hands unfolded yellowed papers and read aloud the words they had once sworn to forget. One former officer, interviewed in 1991, said quietly, "I am 80 years old. I thought time would bury the past, but time only uncovers it again." Across Germany and Russia, memorials were built, not of victory, but of remembrance. In Volgograd, once Stalingrad, German and Russian veterans stood side by side for the first time, weeping together before a monument of stone and snow. Cameras recorded the moment, and one reporter asked an old German soldier why he had come back after 50 years. He answered, "Because the dead are still here, waiting for us to tell the truth." That moment captured the essence of the Eastern Front's legacy. A truth too painful for one lifetime, yet too important to die with those who lived it. These confessions, written in diaries, whispered in cells, buried in archives, became not just the testimony of a war, but a warning carved into the memory of mankind. The Eastern Front was more than a battlefield. It was a mirror showing what happens when ideology devours empathy, when obedience replaces conscience, when humanity forgets itself in the snow. In the 21st century, the last living veterans of the Eastern Front are fading into history, but their voices still echo through dusty tapes, preserved letters, and trembling words captured decades ago. What began as whispers of guilt has now become a global conversation about memory, forgiveness, and the cost of obedience. In 2008, historians uncovered new Soviet interrogation reels, hours of confessions never before heard. One belonged to Heinrich Müller, the young soldier whose letters began this story. His voice, crackling through an old recording, said softly, "If I had known what we were becoming, I would have dropped my rifle and walked home." Hearing that voice 70 years later sent shivers through classrooms across Germany, where students now study these testimonies not as distant history, but as warnings carved into the human soul. The Eastern Front has become a symbol, not of glory, but of what happens when compassion dies in the pursuit of power. In both Russia and Germany, museums now preserve personal relics, scorched helmets, frozen diaries, torn photographs, and letters never sent. Each object tells a fragment of truth, each confession a fragment of redemption. Yet even now, historians argue, can men who committed atrocities truly be forgiven? Or does remembrance itself become the only form of redemption? One Russian survivor, interviewed before his death, offered an answer that silenced the room. "Forgiveness," he said, "is not for the dead, it's for the living who choose to remember." Across Europe, young Germans have begun tracing their grandfathers' journeys, visiting sites like Stalingrad and Kursk, not as tourists, but as witnesses. In Volgograd, where the snow still falls over fields of iron and bone, the descendants of both sides now light candles together every February, the anniversary of Stalingrad's end. No speeches, no banners, only silence, and the faint sound of wind moving through the ruins. That silence is its own confession. It carries the weight of millions of stories, soldiers, medics, civilians, each swallowed by the cold, each hoping their truth would one day be heard. As modern historians digitize the last of the war diaries, they discover something extraordinary. Many of the men who confessed, even under Soviet captivity, wrote not to seek mercy, but to warn the future. One note found in an unmarked folder in 2016 read, "If you are reading this, remember us not as monsters, but as proof of what silence can create." That, perhaps, is the final confession of the Eastern Front. Not a cry for forgiveness, but a plea for remembrance. The snow that once buried them has melted, but the truth remains. These are not just the stories of soldiers, they are the echoes of humanity itself, caught between survival and conscience. And as we listen to their words today, we are reminded that the greatest enemy of any war is not the other side, but the loss of compassion within ourselves. And that was Confessions from the Eastern Front, a journey through the memories of those who fought, fell, and tried to find their humanity in the coldest war ever fought. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect and remember. History isn't just about dates or battles, it's about people, their choices, and the echoes they leave behind.
If you enjoyed this story and want more true emotional tales from history's hidden corners, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep remembering, because the past only lives as long as we tell its stories.